All right, let's get going. So we have a lot to cover. This is the response to intervention section of the course, and it's a really interesting topic. So we are definitely going to spend some time today talking about it. Our objectives are, of course, students will be able to define RTI, and what do we do with it? What is it really? And then what are the steps and procedures for decision making in RTI? And we'll sort of touch on this last objective, but there's going to be another module that's going to come a little later in the course when we've had some time to talk about sort of the statistic-based stuff that's coming later in the semester. And then we'll tie that back in with decision-making for RTI. So how do we actually use that data? So something to look forward to. All right, so what is it? It's a multi-tiered approach to struggling learners. So I'm not going to read PowerPoint to you, but the idea with RTI is that we know that students need help frequently in the classroom, but not everyone needs the same amount of help. So we have these multiple tiers to sort of define what help needs to be given to students. And the idea is that we want students to get the help if they need it, but then I don't need to spend my time with you doing these sort of exercises if you don't need this help. So trying to sort of make decisions on who really needs this help and what kind of help do they need. All right, so why we really want to incorporate data-based decision-making into the educational system. And it's not just us as teachers who want this, lawyers, lawmakers, lawyers, researchers, educators, even the president and Congress want this to be happening, as is evident by the amount of legislative actions that we are receiving and feeling the ramifications of now down in the school level. All right, so previously, back this train back up, we had a sort of a wait to fail approach. We are trying to get students help earlier now, so that's really the point of RTI's sort of blossoming in the schools. We're trying to get the students out of special ed if they don't really need special ed, because special ed is a very specific set of needs that students who really need special ed need, but if you don't need every aspect of special ed, then you shouldn't be there. If you just need more support on a few things, then maybe you should still be in the classroom and not, in a special education classroom. All right, so that's one of the main goals. Just as a sort of side note, once you're in special ed, you're not actually following under the purview of RTI because it's, past RTI. But otherwise, everyone is going to be receiving some form of response to intervention. So we start this with the 2004 IDEA legislative movement here, where we start adding in assessments. There's this huge drive, so to speak, of getting assessments and making decisions with data. And that's where it first starts. And it doesn't, maybe trickle down into the schools and actually have full-on implementation at that point. We're definitely getting there, if not there now, though. So the IDEA allows us to have a lot of diagnostic assessments to help us understand and diagnose students earlier. All right, so the idea of RTI with this happy little animation is that we have everybody we're on the edge of getting everybody on the umbrella, or under the umbrella rather, not on. And so the problem then lies when you have that person who is not under the umbrella or borderline. We need to make sure that they are all being taken care of and not to be, leaving anyone behind. All right, so some of the facts here, RTI didn't exist before 2006. Like I said, in 2004, we started the movement. 2006, it really starts getting implemented. It's a federal mandate now that you have to be doing this. That being said, there are still some states that they don't do it. No, I have no idea why. So you might find yourself, if you move out of Florida, that you're in a place that doesn't deal with RTI. Who knows? But you should be in a place that is using RTI. And that's not to say, though, that if you're in a private school, that's a whole nother ball game. They have their own thing, and what they do is not, mandated by movements like this. So when I'm talking about education like this, I'm talking about, public education for the most part. All right, so now we have this sort of movement, and teachers are given a lot more autonomy about who needs what. So you're expected to be able to diagnose learning disabilities. They will ask you with your progress monitoring and your CVMs and your assessments to, have a full range of data on a student and then make a diagnosis. What are you seeing the student's strengths and weaknesses are? Are you noticing that there's kind of a problem in, Tanisha's reading ability? Is she mispronouncing words, or if she's reading in a line, is it not coming out correctly? And so you're, the first line of defense, so to speak. All right, so in general, RTI is using curriculum-based measurement, which is nicely abbreviated as CBM. So it's generally this idea of whether students meet a standard or not. So it's kind of like a hard wall cut point. You either are meeting the standard or you're not meeting the standard, and that's really how there's growth is measured in RTI. And they say growth, but they mean educational progress. In Florida, we're mostly interpreting SLOP. Nope, that's slope. Sorry about that. We generally are interpreting slope, and we're sending it to the school psychologist. Not every school has a school psychologist, so you may not be sending it to anyone particularly, but in general, we're looking at slope in our own state. You might have another teacher, a leader, or you might have a school psychologist to help interpret this data. It's kind of hard to say what kind of situation you'll end up with. So you have to just be prepared to understand the process and the point of RTI and how your role in it and how it works. Because your role in it might be different depending on where you are and the sort of resources your school has to support you. Another note before we start really diving in, there are generally 3 tiers, and we're going to talk about the 3 tiers, but that's not exactly a prescribed thing. There's sometimes 4. Sometimes the 4th tier is really a very specialized, even less of the population in tier 4 before it gets put into special ed. Sometimes there's only 3 tiers. So that's going to be, again, a sort of a thing where you come into the situation, to your district, your school, and you find out once you're there what exactly you're dealing with. All right, so how is it working? We've got these 3 tiers. We've got a very small percentage of the population in tier 3. This is 5 to 10%, and they're generally getting very intense instruction. So that's tier 3. You shouldn't have that many people in tier 3. All right, so tier 2 is about 15% of your students, and you're doing a lot of progress monitoring, and you're still getting a fair bit more instruction than you would give to your normal students. And then tier 1 is almost everyone. So this is universal education here. Tier 1 is your very good instruction. And a thing to note here that's rather important is that these tiers build. So someone in tier 2 is still getting tier 1 instruction. someone in Tier 3 is still getting Tier 1 and Tier 2 instruction. It doesn't just die off and they're in their own bubble. This is in addition to. So as we move through these tiers, it's not just like you decided one week that this person is Tier 2 and this person is Tier 3 now in the second week. These are documented, data-driven decisions that you make, whether a student is in Tier 2 or Tier 3. There's a lot of assessment data that builds into that decision. All right. So part of this, and it's a really important part in my own personal opinion, is an IEP. And I have a good resource on as a hyperlink right here about really understanding IEPs and who's involved in the IEP. I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but the website I've got right there is really a very good resource about, and it's mostly for parents, about what to expect and how this whole situation works. Now, of course, take a look at this and then also see what your own school situation is, because every school is going to handle the creation of IEPs differently. All right, so what's this thing, IEP? It's a legal document that anyone from age 3 to age 22 or high school graduation, whatever comes first, may qualify for. And it's a legitimate contract with the government about the services the student qualifies for. And there's a whole lot of testing involved in the creation of the IEP. Not everyone's going to qualify for an IEP. So sometimes you'll go through all these motions and you'll get to the eligibility meeting, and if the student will fail to qualify in some aspect, but they might still qualify for a 504 plan. So you would still then have to give them some additional support in some other way, but it might not be a full IEP plan. All right, so the questions I think of when I think about IEP is who's involved, what happens, and how often do I have to deal with this? So insofar as who, there's two main things about IEPs. There's an evaluation meeting, which is the very first meeting of the whole thing. It's the eligibility meeting, really, where we sit down and we hammer out what you're eligible for, and we create a contract. And then that is also where you have the psychologist and the state representative there, and generally you have an administrator, maybe the special education teacher if they're available. Sometimes at that first meeting they may not be available, and then you the instructor are there, and also the parents are there. Surprise, surprise. And if the student is 16 years old, they are expected to be at this meeting as well. All right. All the other meetings are generally parent-teacher IEP meetings. They're not, you're generally on your own to explain the data and the progress that the child has made during the time you've been working with them. So maybe sometimes the school psychologist hangs around. Frequently, the planning meeting is right after the evaluation meeting. So sometimes you'll get the school psychologist to hang around for a little bit, which is very nice, of course. It's always nice to have someone else help you to explain this to a parent. But that's not always the case. I'd also like to mention here, because it's not in that list, the parent has a right to have an outside member and a translator there at that meeting as well. Okay. All right, so what goes on here? We discuss problem areas. We discuss eligibility supports. We create a plan for you, the teacher. We create a plan for the child, and we hammer out this document. We set a lot of goals, and we look, in later, after we were at the evaluation period, we start looking at data. We look at the trends, we look at the CBM and gap analysis and those slopes I was telling you about. And we're generally trying to also find the measures and sort of come to a consensus about a frequency of assessment. Let me finish this section and then I will show you the handout I have for this. So this is one of those last things about IEPs is that it's reevaluated every 3 years to see if the student is still eligible for these services. And something that's really necessary for you to know is that parents are to get updates about the child's progress through this contract. You legitimately have to set aside time in your schedule to report back to the parents multiple times per year about their student's progress or their child's progress. And that's kind of an important thing to remember, that it continues past putting these supports in place. So let me show you the IEPs. All right, so here's the meeting checklist. So this is one that's coming out of the state. So Florida, one of Florida's versions. This is a district of Florida that has this particular RTI one. They make a note of every person there. But what you really want to start noticing is that they talk about the problem identification, that you have all these different things that you're capturing, the gap analysis, benchmark data, and then we start doing this problem analysis. Now this is a very interesting sort of thing, and we're going to talk about it in a few slides from now, where we start trying to identify reasons for these issues, and then you're technically doing research with the student as your subject as part of the IEP. And then you have hypotheses associated with the student. So it's a very interesting sort of document. And then these are the interventions that you have developed clear plans for progress. And this is a plan to help you do that. And then, of course, number 25, a follow-up meeting was scheduled. So that's pretty normal. The actual, that's the wrong document. Here we go. Here's the IEP. So this is the IEP. This is just a blank Florida version of the IEP. And let me just say that if you happen to get to your district and your district doesn't use this IEP, that's normal. Some IEPs can be many, many, many pages long, like we're talking, 15 to 20 pages of documentation. This one's 5. It's really a very, up to the county sort of issue about what kind of length the IEP requires. And in the IEP, you generally have to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the child, the most recent evaluation, the needs that they qualify for like, for example, Braille, need for assistive technology, special transportation services, and then you start looking about the structure that they are requiring. Okay, so this is a big part of it right here, the measurable annual goals. So I'm just saying that the IEPs are quite involved. They are very much so related to RTI, where you're having to analyze all of the students' data and make decisions about placement. And as RTI is intensive instruction, well, that's possibly one of your plans for the child, that they would be in tier 2 or 3 doing this for X amount of days, or this X amount of hours, or with the reading coach for this percentage of their time. Anyways, let's get back to the slides. And let's walk. There we go. All right. So let's get back to RTI again. It's promising this earlier identification. Well, of course it is. If you're having to do all this testing and identification and monitoring of your students, then of course you're going to identify problems. So yes, better and earlier identification, check. It is actually very good at that. This more effective intervention, intervention is only as good as the people trying to implement it, right? But yes, we are actively trying to do this, and it is definitely identifying students with specific learning disabilities faster than waiting for them to fail the curriculum. Okay, it's really important because it's kind of reflecting this merge between No Child Left Behind and IDEA, and it also is hitting on the new laws on ESSA that are coming into play just now. And it's definitely, building upon itself. We had, this very, very good idea, good intentions sort of document about what it should be, and it's now being implemented in the schools and is really doing a very good job. And I, in line with what we've just been talking about, it is using formative assessment more so than summative assessment to make these decisions and shape instruction, which is really something as teachers we should be very much so promoting, because a formative assessment is something that's happening more often and is giving us an accurate, portrayal of how our kids are doing. So anything that does that is generally okay in my book. All right, so RTI has a couple of core sections to it. You have this universal screening, and I mean universal. Everybody takes it. Then we have this big component on progress monitoring. So you'll have generally some sort of system. Ames Web is a very common one. There are a few others that are in use, one of which is the new one for the FSA, which is the ESLA FSA. Forgive me, I didn't write it down. I don't quite remember the acronym for it, but it's English Language Arts Formative Assessment System, and there's a math version too. That can help you with the progress monitoring. And then what we've sort of been covering are the tiers, that this is a multi-tier approach to offering instructional support for students. Okay, so we'd start with Tier 1. Tier 1, your primary instruction, everybody gets it. I know I'm reiterating myself, but it's important. Tier 2, secondary intervention level, I give you some extra support. You're already getting your regularly scheduled programming of your, regular class, plus more. Let me break you out and bring you to centered, and I will work with you one-on-one or in small group. Tier 3, almost always this is one-on-one. Sometimes I'll add, bring in a reading coach or a math coach or something like that. Tier 3, like I said, that's you're getting Tier 2, you're getting Tier 1, and you're then getting this also additional support. So that's Tier 3, and of course that's a very much smaller group. All right, so universal screening, not screaming. We get it 3 times a year, and everybody takes it, and you're really trying to identify the students at risk. And it does a fairly effective job at doing that. All right, so progress monitoring. We are required to very much so have a reason why we move people to Tier 2 or 3. We have to be monitoring them. As you could tell probably in the checklist and the IEP formation, RTI requires that you have a plan, really. You are monitoring plan, you are testing hypotheses about why a student is performing poorly on some things, and you have to give the intervention, collect data on the intervention, and then report on the intervention. So these are on you, the teacher, to be doing this. So you are required to do this, and you're required to do it on a frequent basis. So it starts being really important that you understand what you're reading, and so you don't misdiagnose students. That would be really bad. All right. So data-based decision making. We use all this data. It comes into us. We generally chart it somehow. You will have either your own system, or you'll be in a district that has software where you're required to chart everything. BASC2 is a version of this sort of reporting. It's not maybe what you'll see. It's kind of falling out of popularity, but it is an option. Okay. So in RTI implementation, we have generally these two schools of thought. We have standard protocol and we've got problem solving. So standard protocol is you're getting a research-based intervention, but it's not very flexible. It's just this is the standard protocol. Well, I'm sure that cleared it up. But it kind of makes more sense. Standard protocol versus problem solving here. Problem solving is team-based, and I have this sort of modeled idea where I am trying to figure out what the student's problem is. I'm trying to understand where they are going wrong. I'm hypothesizing with others. We're all looking at the same problem, and I'm getting other people's viewpoints and feedbacks and trying to create a team team consensus on what might be the problem and what is the best way to go about, creating an intervention for it, and then how do I test for that. So as you with all that team-based stuff, it's a lot more flexible, but it's harder to do, and it's kind of harder to do for practical reasons, right? Trying to get a bunch of people together to meet to discuss students is kind of difficult. You just don't have that much time in the day. So problem solving is really good, and you'll see it on some of the RTI and IEP stuff, but it's going to really depend on sort of, again, supports you get from your school. Standard protocol is generally you, by yourself, doing it. But again, it's just kind of going to it's going to depend on what you receive and the sort of guidance you receive from your district in your school. So when you think about which is the best approach, so the Kubison and Borch kind of telling you that there is no, consensus about what's the best approach. They are both doing a fairly decent job. Problem solving might have a kind of a better, higher swing to it than just doing it on your own, but again, that's because you're working with others and trying to really dig into the problem and create interventions. If you're by yourself, you're using standard protocol. If you're following the standard protocol insofar as how to diagnose the issue and what tests to use, then you might arrive at the same sort of point as the problem-solving team. But you'll just have gone there on your own. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to be talking about what RTI looks like in the lovely state of Florida. Okay, so in Florida we have our own system, which I'll get to a little later. But right now I'm just going to talk about how it's implemented, period. We have both academic and behavioral. So RTI in Florida is kind of a two-pronged issued event, which is different than a lot of states. A lot of states don't do this. So, woo, Florida, we're special. We are combining these two, and we're still seeing the same 3 tiers that we were seeing before. We have Tier 1 with the core instruction, Tier 2 where you're getting additional supports, and Tier 3 you're getting really highly intensive supports. That is not any different than what the nuanced idea of the tiers were in RTI as a global thing. The behavior systems, though, that is a little different. You're going to have to see how your school goes about actually doing this. because every school's idea of what targeted behaviors and responses to those behaviors are going to be different. So you're just going to have to play it by ear until you get settled into your school, just how that is actually being implemented. Okay, so there's generally 4 questions that we're really thinking about using with assessment data, and is the core curriculum effective? So that's tier 1, right? You want 80% of students hitting their benchmarks, right? So does, Raul know how to create compound sentences? I don't know. Something like that. It's a yes or no question. Can he do it? Yes. Okay, well then he's good in tier 1. If, some other student, John or something, can he complete a paragraph? If the answer is no, then he potentially needs to go into tier 2. And I say potentially because you're going to need assessment data and more evidence than just this to decide whether someone needs to be moved into an upper tier. All right. So you have to ask yourself also, have they had access to an effective curriculum? Absences are always very disruptive. If they've been suspended or their parents have been had issues, or the mobility rates are really, really prominent sort of in South Florida with sort of the migrant community. These are all going to affect whether someone really needs to be in tier 2 or if they're just not been in tier 1 with effective curriculum long enough to really get what they needed. Then here's that piece about Florida. Are we meeting academic or behavioral expectations? So that's definitely a standards question. And then this AYP stuff, if we identify students at risk, we generally can see patterns. It'll be really evident if all the students in a particular clique or something or on the left side of your classroom suddenly need extra support. There might be something else going on in that classroom, but that is more what that question is trying to get at. All right, tier 2, what does this look like? We're looking at really, small group instruction. We're additional, again, to tier 1. We are increasing this academic engaged time, so AET, and it's supposed to really help students with this increased academic engaged time. So just more time on the topics, some extra small group work. And you're generally trying to get closer to the skills that they need strengthened in. All right, so more about tier 2. You're doing progress monitoring, and it's doing additional measures for that specific skill. So that, necessitates right there that you, identify the skill that's in question, and then that you know what sort of measure to use to test on. So that's asking a lot, but as you get going, you'll have certain testing kits available to you, and so this will sort of also be a what can you give because you have it sort of question. So 70% of students in tier 2 generally have a positive response, right? That's good, that's promising, but a small percentage will not. And so for those they need to be in tier 3. And I think maybe I haven't said this so out, frankly, you don't just go to tier 3, right? Even if you have pretty sincere problems, you start in tier 1, you go to tier 2, you go to tier 3. You work your way through it. You don't just automatically skip up and down. All right, So tier 3 characteristics, we've got interventions that are solely based on that particular student. You spend a lot more time with diagnostic and sort of follow-up progress monitoring on these students and on these skills. We drill down as much as possible to figure out exactly what it is that you are missing out on. So as you can imagine, just that testing alone takes a fair amount of time in addition to tier 1 and tier 2 interventions and instruction. Okay, so of course, increased duration and frequency. They can't be completely different interventions. It doesn't really work that way. So if I've got, if I'm trying to get passage, reading fluency out, I will maybe start with a class with, if they're reading books, then I will, as a class, they'll be reading books. And then as groups, they'll be reading books. And maybe I'll be in that group meeting while they're reading and helping them get through the hard syllable words. And then if that's not working, then I'm going to be increasing that even more and start talking about one-on-one, having whoever it is read to me while we're sitting together, or having the assistant or whoever it may be that's in my classroom be reading with them as well. So it's not like it's some sort of strange other thing. It's just more and more and more increased as we get through the tiers. All right, so Florida has this multi-tiered system of supports, is what they like to call it. So sometimes you'll see RTI, calling it what it is, and sometimes you'll see it called MTSS. That's just the way it is. So MTSS is the same idea. You have a high need at the very top of the pyramid. The few amount of students should be at this upper peak. It's the same idea, but that's just what they're calling it. So let me switch screens for a second. Oh, hold up. Is it this one? It's this one. All right. So this is the What's Special About Special Education handout, right? This is going to walk you through Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, the defining characteristics, the focus, the goals, who it's for. The who it's for is pretty simple. Everybody's getting Tier 1. Tier 2 is anyone who got Tier 1 and still needs help, and Tier 2 is anyone who got Tier 2 and still needs help. And Tier 3. And then we start talking about who is doing this. And that's, I think, a very interesting thing for us as educators to know, that general education is Tier 1. That's pretty well explained. But here it is, Tier 2. You're getting help from your team at the school, but it's you who's doing Tier 2. And it's you in Tier 3, and you're getting more help, the general education and special education and the team. But in general, this is all on you to try and fit into your classroom. So this is, like I said, across all the tiers. Support is coming in through your classroom. It's the students might, if it makes more sense, that if part of what they need is help with writing, well, maybe they're going somewhere with like a therapist or something. That is okay. That's not out of the realm of possibilities, but they're still a member of your classroom. They're not, off in some other class. Okay. So this continues to go on about how these interventions and services are documented. This is where I think it's kind of interesting because, Tier 1 is you. That's just your basic stuff. But in Tier 2 and Tier 3, we start talking about this progress monitoring plan, the 504 plan, and ultimately you're talking about an IEP. So it's an intervention plan that you're creating, and it's in Tier 2 and Tier 3. And if, we just said Tier 2, Tier 3, that's you. So that's going to be interesting. So this is an interesting document. I'm not going to read it anymore. That's enough of that, right? I think we're just going to conclude for a second. I can just do it on the screen here and make it big. All right. We are going to be talking about how you actually use this RTI data. So looking at this, how do I make an instructional decision from this data? We're going to do that in the near future, but I think we need some statistical understanding first. So let's get to there, and we'll just kind of put that on pause. And next time, we're going to be talking about learning outcomes and objective writing. It's going to be really interesting. We'll be talking a lot about Bloom and Bloom's taxonomy and depth of knowledge. So I will see you all very soon.